you'll let me know when a chart comes up.
Sure.
Okay. So I'm sure almost everyone here has seen the chart of Albert Einstein. It should be well known to people. And, I think it's very authentic. I don't think there's any question about whether this is his chart or not. Whether it's a correct degree of logna giving the correct divisional charts, that might be another question, right? But I remember when first seeing his chart and first studying his chart in relationship to his life, I was very curious to see what sort of results the moon period gave, which he ran from age 42 to 52, because of course we see here the moon in its debilitation sign in the 6th house as the second lord. And it's not a dark moon. It's waning, but it's still rather bright, right? And then subsequent to the 10 years Mars period, encompassing most of his 50s, he ran the Mars period, which is, of course, the 6th lord. So he ran consecutive periods where he's running a planet in the 6th house and then a planet who rules the 6th house. Of course, Mars here is the 6th lord in the 8th, in its exaltation sign with Rahu. Now, the fact is, if you look at the facts of his life, during the moon period, he was regarded as a leading scientist in Germany. He held posts at universities. He was being inducted or asked to join very prestigious scientific societies. He did some world traveling during this time, in which case he would be welcomed by heads of state and honored in that way. So clearly, the moon period, from one angle, was giving him some very good results. You would even say Raja Yoga-like results. Is there some principle of Jyotish that people might be aware of that would potentially predict such results in this period of a debilitated moon in the 6th house?
Voodoo's clue.
Pressure exception.
So let's go with that first. Why don't you explain? I think most people understand what you're saying, but maybe not all, Peter. So why don't you enumerate that or define that?
Well, that occurs when we have a debilitated planet in one of the trick houses. When the Lagna Lord itself is strong, it can give the reverse of what we would consider to be a debilitation and make it very strong. And
give Raja Yoga, right? Now, he's quoting passages from the chapter on Raja Yoga in Brashahor, in which I wrote an article about, and most of you are aware that K.N. Rao would refer to this as that great Parashara's exception, right? Because we wouldn't expect a debilitated planet in Dushtandas to give such result. But I've written an article about that. Many of you may have seen that article showing many such examples. The 3rd and the 6th house in particular, debilitated planets there seem to be able to do this. Now, the idea is that the Lagna Lord must in some way, have strength. And here, of course, Mercury as the Lagna Lord in the 10th, it's in debilitation sign, but of course, there's very effective cancellation going on here, and it actually gives Nicha Bhanga Raja Yoga. So, Peter, I think part of the explanation is this idea that, the moon here is giving that great Parashara's exception. Now, Durang mentioned Udu's clue. Most of you are aware of what he might be referring to. He's talking about the nakshatra lord of the moon, which is also going to get activated during this time and to some degree give its results. Whose nakshatra, Durang, is the moon in?
Jyeshta nakshatra mark, it's the nakshatra of Mercury.
Ruled by Mercury, right? And so, of course, the real incredibly fame-giving combinations in Einstein's chart is, first of all, the exchange between 9 and 10, right? But then, you've got the first lord in the 10th, Raja Yoga by placement by itself. It gets Nicha Bhanga Raja Yoga. It's with the 9th lord. That's a 1-9 combination. These are joined by a sun getting Dikbala, directional strength in the 10th. So this is the combination that shows the potential for the great fame that he had experienced in his life. And to some degree, that's getting activated by the moon because the moon's in Mercury's nakshatra. But, then most of you are, by the time he moved into his Mars major period, it was the early 30s, and most of you should be aware of what was going on in Germany at that time. the Nazis were coming into power, right? Now, Mars also gave Raja Yoga to a very large degree. And I'll say more about that in a minute, what that meant actually. And again, by what principles of Jyotish could that have been potentially predicted or predictable? Somebody else, maybe somebody else who hasn't answered. Yeah.
So Viparit Raja Yoga, the sixth lord in the eighth house.
Yes, I believe, one part of that explanation for this is the activation of the way in which the sixth lord, as I talked about in the article, can form a particular variety of Viparit Raja Yoga, referred to in Baladipika as Harsha Yoga, that puts the sixth lord either in the 8th or the 12th house. Here it's the sixth lord in the 8th in considerable strength, being in its exaltation sign, right? And then it's with Rahu, so has the additional influence of a natural malefic, which is also said to be part of the definition of Harsha Yoga. And then, of course, who's Mars' dispositor? Of course, it's Saturn, which you get back in that combination in the 10th house. And now in this case, what is Udu's clue telling us? Whose nakshatra is Mars in?
And Uttarashada.
Moon's nakshatra.
Take a closer look.
No. Sun's nakshatra.
Sun's nakshatra. And again, so we're back into that combination, in the 10th house. Would the moon have given the experiences that it did without being in Mercury's nakshatra? Would Mars have given the experience that it has without being in Sun's nakshatra? I don't think so. That's an opinion. There's no way of knowing that for sure because it's a theoretical consideration. Yet at the same time, of course, Mars, if you look at what was going on in his life, there was a time of great upheaval. He had been accepting invitations both in Europe and, in America and in England, right? And was traveling when the Nazis did come into power, and any Jewish professors, of course he was Jewish, any Jewish professors were removed from their positions. They lost their positions. And, friends and colleagues in Germany told him he should not come back to Germany. So essentially, at the very beginning of the Mars period, what happened is he became a refugee. First, in England, and then eventually by 1933, it was either Mars Rahu or Mars Jupiter, depending on what month. He was invited by Princeton University in the U.S. to be involved in what was called the Institute of Advanced Scientific Studies. So in other words, he obtained a position. And actually, he, from 1933 until his death in 1955, he occupied that position. And, the reason I sort of mention all this is that in my experience of seeing what happens when people are running planets that give Viparit Raja Yogas, they can give Raja Yoga, meaning they can give them success, they can give them position. Of course, during this period, he was a part of the Manhattan Project, famous or infamous, depending on how you want to characterize it. That was the development of the atomic bomb, during World War II. And, he was involved with that group of scientists who, did this. You see the 8th house has to do with subtle energies in nature, both in, those in the subtle body of human beings, but also subtle energies in nature, which includes nuclear atomic energy. These yogas usually come with struggles, with obstacles, with upheavals. Sometimes you go down before you go up. They can give, under the right circumstances, Raja Yoga effects, as the classics in Jyotish suggest they can, but they usually come with other things. I like to say they come with baggage, and certainly, the Mars period for him did give him status, did give him position. His fame only grew in the Mars period. but it also brought real upheaval. Of course, the eighth house is a house of major change and transition, and all these sorts of things. So this is why I wanted to particularly discuss and share this chart about periods of planets both in the sixth house and then also ruling the sixth house in his case. Any else want to comment or any question about anything we've said thus far?
Mark, just a question. Did he have really powerful enemies at this time?
Well, what would you consider the Nazis?
Right, because six Lord being so strong, and you said that he moved in the Rahu Mars period from the moon. Both planets go to the third house.
Right. Good. That's a good additional in the house of movement. Right. That's a good observation. But yeah, they took his position away. They, were burning his books. He was, basically made into this sort of villainous kind of individual. He probably would have ended up in a concentration camp had he gone back to Germany. Right? So yeah, I would say he had some pretty powerful enemies during that time that he got victimized by. Right? Now, obviously his destiny unfolded in certain ways that he went on to do what his destiny intended to be, but it was in the U.S., not his homeland. Any other thoughts and questions before we move on here? I'm glad you mentioned the idea that from the moon, these planets, both of them are in the third house, because it resulted in a major migration for him, right? Okay. So Prince Andrew of England, not having a very good time lately, right? I don't actually read the stories, but I've seen headlines. And he has a history in his life of being involved in sex scandals. Even as a young man, it came out, or somehow the media, the press discovered that he was having relationships with a porn star, some woman named Koo Stark, and he got labeled Randy Andy. But then, now he's under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of controversy for having been involved with Jerry Epstein. And he's being sued by a woman who claims that he had sexual relationships with her when she was underage. And this is all over, of course, the British tabloids. But, before we get into sort of that timing and how that gets reflected, the reason I'm showing this chart is, of course, is that his chart features Jupiter as the sixth lord in the sixth house, but of course also with Saturn. He was actually born in the Jupiter major period, born into a royal family, born into a very high birth. Is there any yoga that Jupiter would be involved in from the birth lagna that would be a very distinguishing feature of his chart and might hint at something like this?
Lagna yoga.
Oh, Ekaterina, very good, very good. Why don't you explain what you're seeing there in terms of Lagna yoga?
From the ascendant from Lagna, the three benefics, Jupiter, Venus, and Mercury, are in the 6th, 7th, and 8th house. In this case, each one is in one house, means separately. So, and the ascendant should be strong. Here
Right.
we see, the ascendant should be strong. Moon is debilitated, but it's dispositive house. There is kind of
well, the ascendant's well placed. It's not strong in the sense of Brahmajya dignity. Actually, that's not, it's a better Lagna yoga if the ascendant lord is also well placed and strong, but it's not a condition for Lagna yoga. Otherwise, I don't know if someone just handed me this chart, would I see it as have been the chart of someone who was born into such a high birth and had such a high status in life. Certainly the Lagna yoga contributes to that, right?
Is there a Parvata yoga here, Mark?
Well, would there be Parvata yoga or not?
I think so. The Lord goes to an angle or a trine, and the dispositor is exalted in an angle.
No, it's absolutely. Well, first of all, what's the definition of Parvata yoga for those who may not be familiar?
it's I guess the literal translation is mountain yoga.
No, not what the word means. Yes, the word literally means mountain, and it's a yoga for status. And it's really an important one to see here, or again, you can hardly explain why he was in the position that he was in. Parvata yoga, folks, is when the dispositor is the dispositor yoga. It's when the dispositor of the Lagna Lord is in an angle and a trine owner exaltation site, right? Which is, exactly what we see here. And it really redeems this very debilitated moon to a large extent. Of course, the moon is well placed in terms of the being in the fifth, but not in this great condition. But then it's dispositor Mars, Yoga Karaka planet for this Lagna, right? Is so strongly placed in an angle and in its exaltation site, right? And then the Mars-Venus combination, I think, is actually, for one thing, that's gotten him in trouble in life, right? In terms of, certain, maybe sexual addiction type inclinations, but what kind of yoga do these planets also form? Venus, Mars in this chart.
Fourth and the fifth lord, or the fourth and the fifth lord in the seventh house, giving Raj Yoga.
Right. And then also what kind of yoga? Because Venus rules some other house.
Dhyana yoga. Dhyana,
Sorry?
the 5th, 11th, the house in wealth. Yeah.
It's Dhan yoga as well, right? It's Dhan yoga well. And of course, he married this woman, Sarah Ferguson, sort of a fiery redhead that was very sort of strong-willed and outspoken, and caused a lot of controversy. And of course, their marriage ended in divorce. Where could that potentially be seen rather clearly? I mean, why would this be a chart where a person would marry but also likely divorce?
Mars in the seventh house, Mark, and the seventh lord in the sixth, 12th of itself, and Mars in the
right. Okay, good, Drake. So we have a natural malefic in the seventh. That can always create some conflict in marriage, right? Venus, natural Karaka, also gets afflicted by Mars, but really probably it's the combination as the seventh lord Saturn in the sixth house with the sixth lord, right? Seventh lord Saturn in the sixth with the sixth lord. Now his current, what's the house of scandal? What scandal and also sort of mental agony that can result when you're involved in the eighth house. And just before the webinar this morning, I wanted to see, because this is really coming out now. He's been sued by this this person, and it's in all the news headlines. And it's happening in the major period of Venus, and the sub period of Mercury, who's of course in the eighth house with affliction, right? It's Mercury in the eighth house with the aspect of Saturn as the eighth lord, right? So not a good period, not a good period for the prince. Right? Any other thoughts or comments about this chart before we move on?
I want to make a point, Mark. Yes.
Go ahead, Drew. Go ahead, Drew.
All the trick lords are in trick houses. Do you think that it forms a major Raj Yoga?
Well, yes, and here's why. I mean, he was born, I'm glad you mentioned this because I forgot to comment about this. He was born in Jupiter, but, at the very end of Jupiter. And so, of course, what period came next? And the period that came next was the 19 years of Saturn, during which, by the way, he had military training. It's very traditional for the princes of England to, go into the military. They all do. Prince Charles, his father did, right? And then the sons of Charles, Henry and William both had. And so you can see that influence of the sixth house having to do with the armed services. You actually saw it was part of the Falkland War when the Falkland Islands were invaded by Argentina, and Argentina and England essentially went to war. He was flying helicopter missions during that conflict. But the point I'm coming to is that he's a prince in his Saturn major period and living a very, very privileged existence, right? And so how can that status be seen in the Saturn major period? And it's the eighth lord, of course, in the sixth house with the sixth lord. And so is that giving Sarala Yoga? It appears so, right? Now, you also mentioned that Mercury is the 12th lord in the eighth. So yeah, we have Uttara Kamarita would say that this is and there's connection also here between Mercury and Saturn, obviously, because Saturn's aspecting Mercury. So you have all trick lords in trick houses, not together and not in the same trick house, but they're also all connected, right? And whose nakshatra is Jupiter on here? I'm sorry, whose nakshatra is Mercury in? I gave it away.
Jupiter's nakshatra.
Jupiter's not nakshatra. So it raises the question of whether there's this full Viparita Raja Yoga here, right? And given, again, what these periods have given and his status in life and so on, because there's not a lot of, sort of the conventional Raja Yogas here, right? We've got, Mars and Venus as angle trine combination, and you've got, the Lagna Lord Moon as the first lord and the fifth, that's Raja Yoga by placement. So, thank you for bringing that up. Anything else?
Mark, it is also possible, like you said, that it is in the Antardasha of Mercury, right? Or Pratyantar of Mercury, right? He's going to,
No,
he's
in
facing
the sub-period, Antardasha. He's running Venus, major period, Mercury, sub-period.
So the 12th Lord Mercury of bed pleasures in the 8th house of scandals. And along with the
hold on though. He's not having the bed pleasures now. Right? they may have came earlier. I think it's more the fact that he's in a scandal now, and it's the Mercury in the 8th house aspected by the 8th lord. We're going to move on. So most of you, I think I've misspelled his name here. Sorry. This is Jawaharlal Nehru, first prime minister of India, and then of course he was a member of the Congress, very prominent member of the Congress Party, and of course very much a part of the Free India movement when India was looking to gain its independence from the British Raj. And his chart has interested me from the standpoint of what our topic is today, because of course he has Jupiter as the sixth lord in the sixth house. Now, you were bringing up the question whether such a sixth lord gives you strong, powerful enemies, but whether, it's also said that, triumph over enemies can come about when you have a very strong sixth lord, right? He did have a very powerful enemy called the British Raj, who did jail him for a considerable amount of time, right? But he eventually also triumphed over those enemies. And since I mentioned him being jailed, what combination in his chart shows the potential for being imprisoned? He did for political reasons, not for crimes, obviously.
But the flanking of the Lagna, the Bandhana Yoga.
Yeah, the Bandhana Yoga. Bandhana obviously means bondage, Bandhana Yoga. And, there are different types of Bandhana Yogas, but, one of the more easily recognizable types is when there are natural malefics on both sides of the Lagna. Another word for that, of course, is Papakatara Yoga. But you can see that in his case, it's not just a question of the Lagna being hemmed in this way. It's both the Lagna and the Lagna Lord, right? It's both the Lagna and the Lagna Lord. And, some of that jail time happened in his moon major period. But then, of course, something else happened in the moon major period. Most should be aware. He became prime minister during the moon major period. And besides being the first lord in the first, which is always a good placement for the Lagna Lord, by itself, it does not give any elevating, type of yoga. What yoga is the moon involved in here that could elevate you?
Mukta Yoga.
So you're seeing it. There's a Mukta Yoga here brought about by the fact that Jupiter is in its Mula Trikona sign, falling sixth in this case. If it was falling 6 or 8, it would produce this Mukta Yoga. And it's, of course, during this time that he wore the crown, right, and was becoming more and more prominent in Indian politics, right? But, and so this is something that is strong. And of course, he won an election. Right? This is how you get elected. I mean, this is how you, in a democratic system, this is how you gain the highest position is through election. And, many of you are aware, you've heard me talk about it, and I've, stated in articles how a strong sixth house, sixth lord, it can be very good for success in elections or any types of competition, but essentially an election is a competition. And that happened for him in his moon major period. But the sub period, as some of you may be aware, does anybody remember or anybody aware of what sub period he actually became prime minister?
Venus.
Who said this?
I said
said
that
this?
one. I
Oh,
said.
Drew?
I
Oh,
also
Drew.
said.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Taram
yeah.
also said.
Yeah, it was the Venus major period. And again, why the Venus major period? What, again, by what principles of Jyotish could this sub period, put him on the throne, as it were, or, give him this position?
I think
Venus is
they are
good.
both mutual
Drew.
co-workers. Because Moon is mutual
Good.
co-workers, it's 1-4 combination here also. Venus is in 4th house of thrones also.
Right. So one of the first things that Drew's referring to is an article I wrote called Intimate Connections. It was about a chapter in Prashahora that states when two planets in dignity are in angles from each other, especially if they're in angles on the birth chart, they become what's called mutual co-workers and can give and will give Raja Yoga in their periods and sub-periods, right? And of course, this would be a combination of the first lord and the fourth lord. Fourth lord is very strong here, of course, giving the Mahapurusha Yoga, both from the moon and from the birth lagna, since they're the same, giving Malavya Yoga. But Ken Rao always referred to the fourth house as the Simhamsa, means the seat of the lion, which is a euphemism for the idea of the throne, right? Occupying the seat of power, right? The seat of power. And we see that happening here. But one thing I like to point out about this chart, of course, he got the position more towards the end of his moon period, moon Venus, but then, of course, remained the Prime Minister of India throughout his Mars period. And in what way does Mars indicate continued sort of very high status?
So Mars is the yoga.
Somebody else that maybe hasn't answered. Yeah, give other people an opportunity here, please. Anyone?
Mars is Yoga Karaka.
Mars is Yoga Karaka, but you think it's simply a matter of that? It's a Yoga Karaka, but it's placed in the third. It has no, at least in this Rashi, has no particular. Do you think there might be something going on here with Mars that indicates maybe?
Mark, isn't there a principle where all the benefics in Kendra and malefics in 3, 6, 11 give a Raj Yoga?
Well, there most certainly is. Okay, so let me talk about that a little, because it's interesting to consider. The very last verse, shloka, in the chapter on Raja Yogas in Prashahora states that when there are malefics in Trishadai houses, 3, 6, 11, doesn't state that they all those houses have to contain malefics, but malefics in 3, 6, 11, and all the benefics are in Kendra. But of course, Jupiter's not here, right? We have 2 benefics in a Kendra, and we have some malefics in Trishadai, but I don't really think that's what's operating here. Now, malefics in 3, 6, and 11, I was quoting from Paladipika. Under certain circumstances, they can give Raja Yoga, and I've seen the validity of that. Some of you may remember an article I wrote called Iron and Steel about Saturn and Rahu, and I showed many examples, including the chart of Mel Gibson, which I showed in this last article, of malefics collecting in the Trishadais and giving Raja Yoga effects when a person runs the periods involved. Does anybody have any other idea why Mars kind of additionally gave this kind of result? rather than just being the Yogacaraka planet.
Udu's clue and Shubhechar. Udu's clue. Shubhechar.
Well, Udu's clue here, who's going to be the Nakshatra Lord? Who's the
Sun.
Nakshatra Lord? The
Sun.
sun, which of course is, that's relevant here because, of course, the sun is in the 5th house of Rajya, the authority to rule. And what important and significant yoga that it is involved in, that the classics say can make you a king, which of course he did become. What yoga
It's
is the
Ubhechari.
sun? Right. It's a pretty good, very good actually. Shubha Ubhachara yoga, only spoiled by Jupiter's connection with Ketu, but otherwise you've got Jupiter on one side in its own sign, and then you've got the 2 other benefics, Mercury and Venus in its own sign. So actually quite a good Shubha Ubhachara yoga. And the fact that he's running his Mars period and it's in the sun's nakshatra, I would also say this has something to do with it. But something else, anything else?
Maybe because Mars is in Kendra Sambandha with Jupiter, giving some of the effect of the Mukuta Yoga?
Well, not just I believe this is it. This would be my explanations, Miriam, because again, going back to the article some of you have seen called Intimate Connections, where clearly a classic of Jyotish considered planets in angles from each other as being a sambandha, as being a connection. And here we've got Mars and Jupiter in angles from each other, fairly close in degrees. It's not super close, but fairly close. And in angles from each other as the 9th and the 10th lords. Right? As the 9th and the 10th lords. And I believe this is, if you take this away, if you don't have this Kendra Sambandha with Jupiter and there's not forming this 9-10 connection, I don't believe the Mars period gives him the status that it actually did, where he's prime minister of the country, right? So interesting to consider. Any other questions, thoughts about this chart again before we move on?
Mark, in this chart, there is also this Malika yoga, this Garvant yoga from the ascendant, from strong ascendant with moon, all 6 planets are in consecutive houses. So which is good for the whole chart, not especially for Mars, but Malika yoga is present, right?
Ekaterina, I'm glad you're here to remind me about this yoga. And you're good. You've been good at that. I think you did it in the last webinar, but it's an excellent example, right? And a rare example, right? Of a certain type of Malika yoga, a garland, as it were, in which planets occupy all 6 houses from the ascendant, which is not a common yoga, right? Not a common yoga at all. So, and it really boosts up the quality of this horoscope, and again helps to explain the rather unique destiny that he had. So I greatly appreciate you mentioning that. Anything else that I'm
just a question on that, Mark? Does Rahu on the just Rahu in the 12th house not break that Malika yoga? I mean,
no, well, not that I am aware of. The yoga doesn't it doesn't require that all the planets being in first 6,000, to my knowledge, Rohit. So I don't think so. Do I know that for absolute certainty? No, I can't say that.
Mark, there is a.
Go ahead, Frank.
Mark,
Yes?
is there a Kal Sarpa quality also to this? I mean, like from Rahu to Ketu, all planets in their grip,
Right.
kind of.
Well, some would say so. I think most of you are aware, again, my astrology is a reflection of my teacher, K.N. Rao, and he considered Kausarpa yoga a bogus yoga, right? Did not believe that it was valid, and actually had his students, a large group of his students in his research group, do a study about this, and they wrote a book about it. Title might have been Kausarpa Yoga, Why the Fright, or something like that, right? It makes instructive reading for anyone who wants to look at that. But a long time ago, I started seeing charts like of Deepak Chopra, of Margaret Thatcher, and I could cite many others that supposedly Kausarpa Yoga was in their chart, and you didn't really see the supposed effects of Kausarpa yoga, right? But, you know, again, people are going to have to make their own decision about this. It's not a yoga that I, quote, employ when interpreting a chart, right? Just my
Thank you,
own opinion and my own view. Okay. So, you know, we've looked at the charts of some real notable individuals. I'm going to start looking at a group of charts of, you know, people from my case studies, case files, in some case, you know, charts that I've been asked to look at by students here, right? So this chart, I was actually asked to be given input about just this last Friday. It belongs to an Indian man. He married into great wealth, by the way. His wife is the heir to a huge fortune in India. But the reason I'm having this chart is that a student of mine is, you might say, their astrologer. And they also get astrological input from other astrologers, apparently, not uncommon in India. He's currently running his Venus Mahadasha. Is Venus involved in any Dhan yoga of any significance?
2-1 exchange. 2-1 exchange.
There's a 1-2 exchange, right? And but he's going to be running his sub-period of Jupiter, which is why we're discussing this chart. Of course, Jupiter is the 6th lord of this chart, 3rd and 6th lord. What kind of planet is it considered for someone with Libra as a result?
Malicious planet, not good.
Functional malefic.
Functional malefic, right? Functional malefic. And of course, Venus here, what other house does it rule?
8th.
8th house. So in thinking about, and by the way, K.N. Rao, you know, he wrote articles that got published in B.V. Raman's magazine, and then later in life, like me, he collected his articles into volumes that became books, right? And a small book in this case, there's a book that he published called Enigmas in Astrology that contains an article about Jupiter, Venus, Venus, Jupiter periods. And he particularly talked about them with respect to Libra ascendants, right? Because Venus rules the 1st, but also the 8th, and then Jupiter rules the 6th, right? Here they're together. So I was being asked to comment upon the potentials of the Venus-Jupiter period, right? If you were asked to do that, what, if anything, might you say on the positive, favorable side, and what, if anything, might you say about the potential downside of this period and subperiod? Take a moment to think about it.
Mark, would you mind sharing the age of this person?
Yeah, they're middle-aged.
Okay, middle-aged. So I mean,
maybe early 40s, maybe about 41 when they move into this period, Rohit. But that's this is important. Let me just say something. This is a good question because Rohit knows that you predict based on Kal Desh Patra, meaning time, place, and circumstances. What time of life is this person in? We know the circumstances. He's a married man in a career in India, married to a very wealthy woman, right? Go ahead, Rohit.
So, I mean, the first, I mean, there are clear signs. I mean, well, I take that word back. There could be physical issues because, I mean, I understand that, you know, see the Lagna, I mean, and the Kendra from the Lagna, there are only malefics that are there. And plus, I understand there's the flanking, which is a saving grace. But at this point in time, especially that he's in Venus, Jupiter, you have the activation of the 8th house from the main period as well as the Antardasha too, and then you have the 3, 6, 8 involvement there. So on the negative side, there could be health issues. On the negative side, there also could be death of one of the parents, which could lead to inheritance because the 8th house is again getting activated. So, I mean, those are just, you know, few observations that I have.
Well,
right.
Good. Well, let me ask, based on what Rohit said, is there any way that Venus also shows an eligibility to potentially bring a health crisis, besides of what Rohit mentioned?
Marika.
Primary marker.
So Venus here becomes a primary marker, falling in the second, huh? And then look at its degrees. Does that strike you at all?
Sarpadrekana. Venus is Sarpadrekana.
Ekaterina, could you explain what you mean there?
There are certain degrees in Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, water signs, and especially in Scorpio, it is the first two Drekana, so from the 0 to the 20th degrees. And Sarpadrekaners are good for spirituality, but not good for medical astrology. I mean, they can give diseases. Yes.
Exactly. So, Venus is the eighth lord. It's a Maraka being placed in the second. It's a benefic in the second, which, there's a shloka in Laghu Parashari, which I'm going to be teaching starting next weekend, that indicates that natural benefics in the seventh or the second become some of the surest killers, which I always found kind of interesting. I don't know why, what would be the astrological logic as to why that would be the case, but I have found it to be true. And again, Maraka doesn't necessarily mean death, but it can mean, bodily suffering due to illness or accident or injury or any of that, right? So the fact that Venus is a primary Maraka here and in this Sarpa Drekana, right? And getting the aspect of Jupiter. And see, one of the things that Sri Rao talks about in that article I mentioned is that, what are Venus and Jupiter to each other?
Well, they're mutual enemies.
Mutual enemies.
They're enemies, right? And ironically enough, being the two best benefics, periods and subperiods of Venus and Jupiter, you'll see sometimes not giving very good effects at all. Of course, that's as a result of a particular context. And he shows many examples in that article when a person ran Venus-Jupiter for Libra Lagna, where Venus is the eighth lord and Jupiter is the sixth lord. And of course, Jupiter here is not just the sixth lord, it's the sixth lord in the eighth, right? And then whose nakshatra is Venus in?
Jupiter.
Do you see the connection here and how Venus and whatever it represents and Jupiter, whatever it represents, is really getting activated during this time?
Mark, does he have diabetes?
I'm not aware that he has any physical health problem at the moment. But clearly, this period and sub-period holds some danger that way. Right?
Mark?
Yes.
If I can introduce a personal note here, I also have Libra Lagna. I have Venus in the sixth in Pisces and Jupiter in the eighth in Taurus in an exchange. And when I ran Jupiter Venus at a year old, I contracted cerebrospinal meningitis.
I've seen it over and over again. But so first of all, thank you for that share, because this feeds into exactly what Sri Rao's article was highlighting and what I have found to be true. Now, let's take it a step further. Jupiter as a subperiod, do you see anything about Jupiter as a subperiod in Navamsha?
Yes, it will be the word of the 64th Navamsha. Yes, these degrees, the 22nd Rekana and the 64th Navamsha, they are also showing potential for health issues, for health. Yes.
Someday, Ekaterina, I'm going to ask a question and you're not going to know the answer. Maybe. Very good. This is exactly what I wanted people to see. That, how do we, lords of, now please understand that if a planet is in or ruling either the 64th Navamsha or the 22nd Drekana, that alone, when a person runs those periods and subperiods, will not typically bring a health problem, right? Or other misfortune. If it's in the birth chart involved in something that can, then it definitely contributes to that. And I taught medical astrology this year, and I showed any number of examples of this, and this could be another one. How do we determine a planet in or ruling the 22nd Drachna? You want to mention that, Katrina? How could you recognize that so quickly?
Yes, in Navamsha it is see the fourth from the moon. It is the word of the fourth house from the moon in Navamsha. It is Sagittarius, so it's easily
Right.
seen. Yeah.
So if you want to identify the 64th Navamsha, the easiest way to do it is see the moon's position in D9, look at the fourth house from there. Any planets in it are going to rule the 64th Navamsha. Any planets ruling it, as Jupiter in this case, is going to be the lord of the 64th Navamsha. Very good.
Mark, just one point. I absolutely don't like Venus in Navamsha.
Well, why not? I didn't like it either. What do you see? I should have, highlighted this as well, but why don't you? So I'm glad you mentioned it. What do you see?
It's aspected by really strong Mars and Saturn on the Rahu Ketu axis in the 6th house from Jupiter. Not to forget, Jupiter is retrograde. So from Jupiter, it falls in the 6th. I mean, from Venus, Jupiter falls in the. I mean, this is not looking pretty.
All malefic influence on Venus.
And the dispositor goes to the 8th.
And the dispositor moon goes to the 8th. And now Jupiter becomes a primary marker for this life. Right? I hope I'm wrong. I hope we're wrong. But Venus, Jupiter holds real danger. Now, here's why I was asked to comment about this chart. An astrologer told them, based on Varshapal, that he was going to have a serious illness during this time. Based on Varshapal. Whether or not he was also making an evaluation based on the Rashi, I'm not aware. But I was told that he made the prediction based on Varshapal. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term, is the annual horoscope, right? Annual horoscopy. So, it remains to be seen, but I thought it was an interesting case to discuss related to this idea of, evaluating kind of results 6th house, 6th lord planets can give, right? I hope it's not true. Okay, moving on here.
I think Mark.
Mark, can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
I think you mentioned that his spouse is rich. Is it because of the 8th Jupiter and maybe Venus and Jupiter from moon, they are forming Dhan Yoga along the 511 axis, and
Absolutely.
Venus Jupiter also forming Raj Yoga from the Dasha Lagna. Maybe that's the reason why.
That is how it can be seen. Yes, and we're talking super wealthy here. This woman has a fleet of luxury automobiles like Rolls Royces. She's like 50 of them or something like that. It's obscene. There's this enormous wealth. I could show you her chart. It's a study in Dhan Yogas, obviously. All right, we're going to move on here because there's other charts that I want to discuss, but these are all great comments. And, this is the chart of an individual who gets these articles. And someone that I gave a consultation to a long time ago, and I would give him input about his son. So, he's someone that I've had sort of regular contact with, and he gets these articles. And he happens to be running, he said it was timely in my article, because he happens to be running major period of Jupiter, but he as of January, moved into the sub-period of Mercury. Obviously, the 3rd and 6th lord for this Lagna, placed in the 9th house in Jupiter's sign. And remember that he's running the Jupiter major period. Now, what good thing does Mercury do here with regards to something? What's one good thing that Mercury does here that really enhances a particular feature or part of the chart?
Well, there's the Saraswati Yoga and Jupiter, Venus, Mercury in, angle or trine. So really good time for spirituality, enhancing his knowledge or her knowledge, and that way so be really good for that.
There's a Saraswati Yoga here. He is a well-educated man. Obviously, he's a student of Jyotish, so he studies Vedanga. right? And he's doing it currently. So, I think you see some expression of the Saraswati Yoga here. What would Mercury as a sub-period favor also as being a potentially, good, desirable
Travel.
experience? Travel, right? Why travel?
It's the third lord in the ninth house. Third lord short travels, ninth house long travels. So
Right.
yeah.
So in Jupiter's the ninth lord itself, right? And that's what's really being activated here. So journeys, both short and long-term journeys, potentially for enjoyment, could be an aspect of this. Does everyone see that Mercury as the third lord aspects onto the third house? Okay.
Yeah, see that.
And again, now he's running Jupiter, who also aspects the third house. Right? So the third house is getting the aspect of its own lord, and it's also getting the aspect of Jupiter. He's actually running Jupiter, Mercury. What could be going on also besides, journeys and travel? What could be a
You
good,
can
favorable?
start writing short articles or start writing.
There
Some
can be-
Yoga.
house of journalism. Yeah.
Starting a business.
Yoga.
Well, now we're getting at it. First of all what you're saying is a logical inference, right? But which house rules your leisure activities, your extracurricular activities?
Third house.
Third house, right? And what's a particular type of leisure activity that very people often engage in?
Short travels.
Especially men, especially
Sport. Some kind of sport.
some kind of sports. That's exactly right. He wrote to me that since January that he moved into this sub-period of Mercury, the third lord of sports and leisure activities, aspecting onto its own house, Jupiter aspecting onto there, and Mercury being in Jupiter's sign. He said his sporting activity, which he's always been engaged in, has increased. He plays golf, he plays cricket, he's an Indian man, and he plays squash. And he says that, he just noticed, it's just been a lifelong thing. It's not just been, now, but he said that, since January, his activities that way have just really increased. Kind of an interesting chart in a lot of ways. You look at this, you look at these configurations along the 1-7 axis, right? First of all, it's a very Kendra-oriented chart because you've got 5 grahas, including the Lagna Lord, then the moon, all in Kendras, right? And first he ran his Rahu period, of course, given the results of Saturn. Now he's in Jupiter. Right? So interesting chart that way. He's a successful businessman. He's part of his own company with partners, right? He says there has been some conflict with partners that have come up, during this particular period, which is not hard to see. I don't think anything too severe. It's not like the partnerships are about to break or anything. So just interesting that his sporting activity has increased here, as he plays competitively. For anybody with Mercury as the third and sixth lord for Aries, it can always give this sort of thing.
Mark, I think he needs to watch out for injuries in his sporting activities because Mercury is the sixth lord in the nakshatra of Venus, I believe. And Venus is a maraka for that Lagna.
True. There's no affliction there, is there?
There's no what?
There's no affliction.
There's no affliction to Mercury, but Venus, being a primary maraka for the Lagna, is with Mars.
No, there's affliction. There's affliction to the Lagna Lord. There's no question about that, right? But and so it's a possibility, sure. So this is an individual well known to me. She's been a woman who's participated in my yoga satsanga that I host in my home on Thursday nights, going back to like 2004. And interesting thing to consider with regards to her Libra Lagna, where Jupiter, again, as we saw previously, becomes the third and the sixth lord. In this case, Jupiter is in its own Mula Trikona sign as the third lord in the third house. Now look at Jupiter's degrees.
It's in the Gandanta.
It's in the Gandanta, but it also produces something else. I found it very interesting. If you go to the chapter on divisional charts in Paladipika, it highlights Jupiter. You know, rarely do the classics give examples. It's just very rare that they actually sort of make a statement and say, okay, here's an instance of it, right? But they do. He does. Mantraswara in Paladipika does in this case, and he's commenting particularly on what happens with Jupiter when it's in these very, very early degrees of Sagittarius. Anybody have any idea what I'm talking about?
The results, Mark, are not very, Jupiter is disturbed.
Well, no, no, that's not what the indication is. Is it? So what? Anybody have any idea about this? Before I just tell you, what happens, folks, is that Jupiter continues to fall in Sagittarius in many of the divisional charts, such that it's Dasa Varga Vimshapaka, meaning it's 20-point strength in the Dasa Varga scheme, which is what's recommended for judging how strongly a planet will give its results using that measure, is very high. I mean, it comes out to be like 18 out of 20 or something like that, right? And so this is what happens to Jupiter at this degree of Sagittarius. In other words, it becomes a real powerhouse. It becomes a real powerhouse. And, you know, I think, Tarang, you mentioned asana previously, right? I've written this article called The Steady and Comfortable Posture, and third house and third lord rules asana. And when this woman was running the major period of Venus, who of course gets the aspect of this Jupiter, and the consecutive subperiods of Venus, Jupiter, and then Venus, Saturn, this woman was absolutely immersed in both doing asana daily for an hour and a half in heat. Was doing that hot yoga, and was also training to be a teacher of yoga asana, yoga teacher, which she became, and actually one of the better ones that I've come to know, and I've known a lot of them. And interestingly enough, the way this fifth lord Saturn in the third house with this powerful third lord, the way it's manifested, she now kind of specializes in teaching yoga to children, and also teenagers, and at-risk teenagers who are in an urban environment and don't have a very good home kind of situation, and that's what has made them ask risk. And she teaches them not just hatha yoga, but also mindfulness meditation and so forth. It's been her life's work, you might say, to be a teacher of yoga asana as a transformative tool in the life of people, particularly for children and teenagers at risk. Very interesting manifestation that way. But this is a third and sixth lord, also under whose influence? What's going on here with this Jupiter on an unfavorable way?
Saturn and Mars's influence. I mean, although
Right.
Saturn is the yoga karaka here, but still a malefic.
No, it's still a malefic. This is my point about, you know, malefic who become yoga karakas, still a malefic. And so there's a conjunction of Saturn here, also the aspect of Mars. She has a younger brother he's very severely impaired in some way. I can't remember exactly in what way, whether it's physical or mental, emotional, but he has a younger brother that has not been very functional in life at all. And so he might even be institutionalized. It's been a long time since I've gotten this input, but there's something very not right about a younger sibling. Right? What other interesting, you know, features in yogas in this chart exist?
The Makuta yoga again, I think.
This Jupiter is also involved in the Makuta yoga, right? she's a very, very successful teacher. People just love her as a teacher. I take her classes. I used to take her classes. You know, she has a very charismatic, sort of dynamic kind of quality, and you know, she's just very, very good at what she does that way. What else do you recognize? Anything?
The 10th house is very strong. Mark, it's making the 9-10, giving her the 9-10 yoga, the best form of yoga in the 10th house.
So for anyone with Libra Lagna, Prashahora tells us that the best, most powerful, you know, angle trine combination is the moon is the 10th lord and Mercury as the 9th lord. Of course, the moon here, it's actually taking place here in the 10th house with the moon in its own sign. What makes this yoga not as powerful as it otherwise might be under different circumstances? What is there some sort of, not really a blemish, but why does it deteriorate in some way?
The moon is very dark.
That's it. That's it.
So it's the 10th lord and the 10th, but the 10th lord, it reduces its beneficence because it's the angle lord.
You know, there's some, you know, the planet that suffers the least from Kendra Adipati Dosh is the moon, because it's the least of the benefics. And it actually would not even be classified as a benefic year because it's almost an Amavasya moon, right? And this is the way that this yoga is not as, you know, versus somebody like Napoleon Bonaparte that had the moon Mercury combination along the 410 axis, but then the moon was quite a bright moon, right? Big difference. And it was an exchange with Saturn as the Yogacaraka in his chart as well. So she's actually running the moon period, and you know she's someone who's been independently wealthy. I think she's a trust fund person. Right? And ever since I've known her, she's been financially independent, has not had to work, and so she can devote her time to causes that she believes in. And she sits on boards and things like this. This is sort of the status that she has, and moves in some pretty, you know, high circles, you might say, as a result of that. I've known her mostly since she's been in her Venus Mahadasha followed by Sun. Why would she be independently wealthy during this time in these periods?
Venus and Sun are, Venus is with the 11th lord from the Lagna, and from the moon, Venus is again the 11th lord in the second, with the second lord.
Well, what Tarang's seeing is that both these planets form good Dan yogas, both from the birth Lagna, where Venus is the first lord in the 11th with a strong 11th lord in its own sign, and then from the moon, the sun becomes the second lord in the second house, and now Venus becomes the 11th lord. You see that they're, you know, they form good Dan yogas from both. So
Mark, does she have a lot of properties?
I wouldn't say a lot. She has a very nice property here in the San Diego area with a big swimming pool, and it's a large property. It's a corner lot, and I'm sure it's worth millions. But I think the family has, you know, but her personally, I'm only aware that she has one property. You asked that because?
Mars in the 8th.
Mm.
I think this was one of Ken Rao's observations. He was saying, you know, Mars in the 8th can give you a lot of landed.
Well, not only that, you talked about, you know, invariably a person gets involved in construction or, you know, around their property. And as a matter of fact, right now, she's putting on a major addition to the house, which is a major construction process and redoing landscaping. So it's been, and she's done other things. So that's been true. But now, you know, there's this combination here. What other combination is Mars involved in here that could be rather unfavorable from one part of life?
Mars is the 7th lord, Mark.
So?
In the 8th, not a good, the 2nd and the 7th. So it's a Marka, primary Marka also from the Lagna.
Well, and, you know, just hold on. It's the 7th lord in the 8th, and what could that not be good for?
It could not be good for the marriage.
Yeah. You know, 8th house is the house of the break, right? And so when the 7th lord is in the 8th, it won't be invariably, I can show you exceptions, but most often than not, if the person marries, doesn't last. And there can be some discontinuity in general in one's relationship life. You'll notice that Venus here, natural Karaka, is afflicted both by Rahu and then also gets the aspect of Mars, right? And she did marry. She married actually someone pretty wealthy, and she might have gotten a good divorce settlement as well, but they did divorce. And I've seen this too. She was with a man in a marriage-like situation. They were living together, and in the middle of the night, the man died, who was older than her, died of a heart attack, which, you know, I've seen the seventh lord and the eighth, again, won't necessarily always be true if you have this combination in your chart, folks, but I've seen it mean that the person, the spouse passes away as well. All right, moving on, kind of getting off topic here.
From the moon also, Mark, the seventh lord was in the sixth from the moon.
Yes, yes. The pattern repeats, you know, making it more of a brilliant pattern. So I knew this person well, and they were getting astrological input from me in their Mercury Mahadasha. And we have another Aries Lagna chart like I was showing you previously. But now, instead of Mercury as the third lord aspecting onto its own third house from Sagittarius, you've got Mercury as the third lord and sixth lord in its own sign in the third house, right? With the sun, but not combust. What could this be good for?
Or competitions and sport.
Sports, right? That could be one thing. One manifestation of the third house, yes. But it really brought into play some other manifestation of the third house that we've mentioned. No, not authorship. Sorry?
No, I said writing, so.
Writing, yeah, no, not writing. Some other one that I mentioned that I actually wrote an article about, the third house. Asana.
Yoga.
Sports.
Asana, yoga asana. This person, and by the way, this was a woman from a British family who was residing in South Africa, and such that she was actually born in South Africa, ended up, you know, migrating to the U.S. Where's the clear indication for something like that in her chart?
Fourth lord and the 12th.
Right. You see here the fourth lord moon goes to the 12th house. But I knew her when she was in her Mercury major period, and she was a Yogananda, SRF, self-realization devotee who moved here because they have a center here. And right next to where the church is, she opened a yoga center, a yoga studio that became extremely successful. Would you happen to think about what sub-periods within the major period of Mercury? First of all, why is she in a leadership role, not just teaching, managerial teaching role? And what sub-periods in ownership level, what sub-periods within the Mercury major period could have been especially good this way and were good?
Jupiter and Saturn.
Very good, Sandeep, very good. Now, why would you say that?
Because that's a 9-10 combination in the 10th house.
Right. Now, we all know, and you've heard me comment, that Brasher goes out of its way to say that the mere connection of Jupiter and Saturn for Aries does not form a good Raja Yoga, right? Doesn't mean they can't give good Raja Yoga. They can't if they are forming a Raja Yoga in other ways. Jupiter here, obviously Saturn's the 10th lord in the 10th, and Jupiter is the 9th lord in the 10th. Her father was very, had a very sort of high successful position in life when she was growing up. The family was, I think, fairly prominent, very well off. But here, she's got this 9-10 combination in the 10th. She runs those sub-periods, and she becomes a very successful yoga entrepreneur, you might say. And an interesting way in which Mercury is both the 3rd lord and the 6th lord manifested is that, the 6th house has to do with illnesses, right? But then also how illness is treated. Therefore, it has to do with therapies, right? Therapeutic can have to do with therapeutic activities. And besides being a teacher of yoga, she offered something which she called yoga therapy, where people are put into asana, but then they're kind of doing the sort of emotional processing that takes place actually in a psychotherapy session and so forth. And she became quite known for and quite successful at doing this. And she ran teacher trainings. She was more successful with yoga as a sort of a business than anyone I've ever seen. She was very, very successful with being a yoga entrepreneur in a variety of different ways during this time. Whose nakshatra is Mercury in?
Ardhara nakshatra, Rahu's nakshatra.
Right. She had a very powerful personality. You can see the Lagna Lord Mars in the fifth here, right? And giving a nodal Raja Yoga with Rahu, right? But what I also wrote about such a combination and wrote an article about this. What is this particular configuration here in the fifth house not good for at all?
Children.
Not good for children, right?
Children. What combination does it give that I wrote an article about? Anybody recognize that?
Denies children or kills.
Jupiter is also debilitated. There is a.
Oh, yes, of course, but that's not what I'm asking about. Please stay on the topic. Well, the curse of serpents. There's this very peculiar chapter in Parashara Horror about combinations that can be for childlessness that relate to curses from a previous lifetime that I wrote an article about. And one of those combinations that's referred to as the curse of serpents is when Rahu and Mars are in the fifth. But there's other reasons. Trang, good for you. You mentioned that Jupiter, natural significator of children, of course, has the affliction of Saturn, right? And the fifth lord itself is not well placed. And of course, it's conjunct the third, but also the sixth lord. Usually if there's a significant dramatic, in this case, there's a lack of children. She never had any children, right? And if that's going to be the case, it's typically because there's a lot of different reasons for that, not just one, right?
Mark, any issues with I don't know if you notice, but like the fifth house is two malefics, right? Rahu and Mars. Mm-hmm. Is the thinking a little different from normal, just to put it mildly?
Well, was there sort of some you see here some, I'm just going to be candid here. Yep. This woman had what I would call features in her personality, what would be called narcissistic features and also borderline features, right? In other words, there was, I think some definite psychopathology. Yep. And I won't go, that can be seen in a number of different ways. In the moon here is in a Dushtana, in a trick house, and you see it gets the aspect of both Saturn and Mars. Right? Yep. Mm-hmm. And then the fifth house has these, which is another thing to evaluate when you're talking about a person's mentality. And now, what do you want to look at? The fourth house, fourth lord, and the fifth house, fifth lord. Mm-hmm. And you see the conditions here. So, she's a very powerful personality and very, very successful, but eventually, because of her pathology, it all fell apart. She actually had to actually close things down and lose her whole business because of what had come out about her abusiveness towards people and some other things I won't go into, but it was her undoing, right? Yep. It was her undoing. So yeah, there was that factor there.
Mark, does this person has anger issues also? Anger issues? Like getting angry or getting...
Well, no, sure. She could fly into a rage. That's very much part of the borderline, syndrome. Yeah, but we said all that, right? I don't want to go into that any further. Okay. So another Aries Lagna chart, someone running their Mercury major period. And they're a teacher of yoga also. They're in their later life. They may have just turned 80, and they teach yoga to seniors, right? and very dedicated to the spiritual path and pursuing moksha. And this can be seen here by the Mercury major period, third and sixth lord again here in the eighth. But what's also not going to be good about this, and it's giving some sort of effect of, you might say, the Viparit Harsha Yoga, right? But what could this also be not good for at all?
Progeny, children.
Why would you say that?
The fifth lord.
Oh, I see. The fifth
house.
lord, fifth lord in the eighth. Yeah, I see. I was just focused on there. Interestingly enough, she actually, I think, a good number of children. She doesn't have a very good relationship with them. It didn't actually prevent her from having children, but I think she's rather estranged from them. It's not a good, close relationship from what I know, although I don't have a lot of information about that. But again, going back here, what could such a period, especially as the sixth lord and the eighth, and then that's not the only thing going on here. What else could be an unfavorable expression of this? Especially given the time.
Health crisis, because Mercury is also the eighth lord from the Dasha Lagna also.
Right. And that's truly what happened. Some of you took my medical astrology course. Who's the natural significator of eyesight?
Mars or Sun?
Which graha? Sun, right? And you have the sun here in the eighth house with the sixth lord. There is the aspect of Jupiter, who doesn't really protect that much, though, because it's retrograde. And you do have the aspect of
Saturn.
Retrograde Saturn, which, when malefics are retrograde, their aspect is worse from the standpoint of medical astrology. And sorry, she's a dear woman, and just very has a positive attitude, and she does a lot of. She hasn't done a lot of good in the world. Her profession was that of a nurse. That was her primary occupation throughout life. But I'm sorry to say she's going blind. There's some deteriorating condition of her eyes that is incurable. There's no real fix for that, and she's kind of slowly and gradually going blind, which of course is, terrifying for her. Right?
Mark, Saturn and Mars in second and 12th. That's the other thing, right? Like you're supposed to see second and 12th for the left and right eye.
Correctly. So you've got, afflictions here too. And you'd even have to see that the second lord is afflicted because it's in this exchange with Saturn, right?
Yep.
So we've got, Mars on one side. And this is KP, right? You're making these comments, correct?
No, this is Barminda.
Oh, Barminder, sorry.
Sorry,
you have a very similar voice to some other student of mine. But you were in the medical astrology course,
yep.
Right? Yeah. And so we were talking about how which house rules the eyes, and the second house. The classics are very clear about that. They state it directly that the second house has to do with the right eye, and the 12th house with the left eye. And this is where you see the two malefics, right? And then the sun here has about its placement and condition. Okay. A sad case that way. So there's a particular reason that I put this chart. I got an email from an individual who reads these articles, participates in this program, and they noted the one part of the article where I'm quoting Paladipika, where it's stating that malefics in Trishadais can give Raja Yoga-like effects. Now, as I stated earlier, I wrote an article called Iron Steel on Saturn Rahu periods, where I gave many examples where this is true. And even in this last article in the chart of Mel Gibson, this appears to be operating. But he was making the note to me that this is the chart of a relative of his whose Mars period was extremely unfavorable and didn't seem to give any quality of Raja Yoga at all. Mars here is even the Yogacaraka planet for this lagna, right? And here it's a natural malefic in the third house. It's with Mercury. Now, of course, Mercury is classified as a natural malefic, benefic, but of course, when it only has malefic influence, it becomes more malefic. why might have this period been so bad? I mean, I wrote him an email back saying it was bad in what way, and he mentioned this, but I'm not going to divulge these sort of things. But it was generally not a good period for them at all, and really didn't bring any sort of Raja Yoga like effect. What's going on here that that could mean Mars giving some very negative, unfavorable type results?
So Mars is basically in a Shatru, in an enemy sign with an enemy planet.
Well, it does have a good dignity, right? But that wouldn't necessarily give it. I mean, its results would be real negative. What's going on here that could be a major issue this way?
It's also aspected by the sixth lord Saturn.
That's it. Saturn here is both a natural malefic, but here also as a sixth lord. In fact, there's a mutual glance here, right? Mars is aspecting Saturn, Saturn's aspecting Mars. And, apparently there was some of the negative effects had to do with the spouse and what was going on with the spouse, right? With Saturn here also being a seventh lord. And they're afflicting each other. Right? Why this would not give any effect of Raja Yoga, it would be a bit surprising to me, quite frankly. Some answers to that may lie to what happens, say, in divisional charts, particularly D10, which I haven't looked at. But this was the case that he states. Anyway, I'm not. Yes.
Mark, additionally, Mars is in the nakshatra of Swati, which is owned by Rahu, and Rahu is also in an enemy sign to itself, right?
And that may have had something to do with it. Yes, it's Rahu's in the Lagna here, so may have something to do with it. The last chart I wanted to discuss today, and you can see why if you look at this chart. 4 planets in the 6th house. And think about who these planets are. You've got Saturn as a Yogacaraka, 9th and 10th lord, in the 6th in its exaltation sign. You've got Mercury here, who's the 5th lord, right? 2nd and 5th lord. Moon's the 3rd lord, Sun's the 4th lord. And they ran their Jupiter period fairly well. Whose period were they born in?
So Rahu.
They're born in the Rahu period, and then this was followed by Jupiter. By the age of 26, they had moved into Saturn major period. And in the article, I think in like most of the last chart I discussed, you saw another chart in which the person had 4 grahas in the 6th house, right? There's some yoga that gets activated here.
Pravraji.
Good.
And includes the 10th house.
Yes. So for there to be a true Pravraj Yoga, the 4 planets must include the 10th lord. 10th lord should actually be strong, not weak, and it should not be combust. Right? And then what other combination here or planets in this house also can contribute towards someone, inclined towards spiritual renunciation or sannyas?
Saturn and Moon.
Right, that's correct. That's right. So you have a Saturn Moon contact here. And what happened is when he moved into Saturn, he did become a monastic of a Indian spiritual tradition for a period of time. Right? But, he didn't remain so. Who's the Lagna Lord and where is it placed?
The 7th.
First Lord in the 7th. What do you think happened in
Married.
Saturn Venus?
Married.
Saturn and Venus. He met a woman, an older woman, by the way. You see in the Vamsha, you'll see that Saturn's in the Lagna and Venus is in the 7th house. So Saturn Venus had to bring this into his life, right? And so he, another woman who was around, sort of the religious organization that he was a part of, they got very attracted to each other, and he ended up marrying and remains married to this day to that woman. So, the Pravaraja Yoga did manifest. And, one of the ways it manifested is that, Saturn here as an exalted ninth lord is the 9th house of the guru, right? And, his guru, his lifelong guru came into, who he was affiliated with, for a long, long time, decades, until the guru passed away, happened in the Saturn major period. And so these were some of the, what I would say, favorable indications of this combination here in the very full 6th house. Right? Okay, so that is our webinar for this month. Lively discussions, as always, with this group. And we'll end as we normally do with our Sanskrit prayer. Ahom asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotir gamaya mitro ma anagam tamaya sarvesham shanti bhavatu sarvesham shasti bhavatu sarvesham purnam bhavatu sarvesham mangalam bhavatu loka samasta sukhino bhavantu ahom shahanti 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 hari om tat sat